Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Lacey, and I am the community manager for Shadow's Edge. It's a free mobile game created by the Digging Deep Project to help teens and young adults dealing with chronic illness. So for many of us, this is a time of year to set new resolutions and goals to establish good habits for ourselves and our families, like losing weight and eating better and doing more yoga. And but this past year was different, to say the least. For a large majority of people, 2020 has been one of the most eventful and stressful years of their lives. Between the COVID-19 pandemic, the fires in the west of the United States, hurricanes in the East Coast, political and social turmoil, and don't forget the murder hornets. The list goes on and on. It's hard not to feel exhausted by everything that's happened. The mental and emotional toll of the pandemic has it just only makes everything so much more of a challenge, especially for teens right now. So for today's webinar, we're going to talk about what comes after 2020. How do we deal with the emotions we have had about what happened? How do we deal with what we experienced to our advantage? And once we do that for ourselves, how do we begin to help the teens in our lives do the same thing, whether it's your child, a patient, a sibling, a student if you're a teacher, things like that. And I'm here today with Dr. Christy Pikiewicz, who is an experienced psychotherapist as well as a mother of 2 teenagers herself.
Oh boy, yes, that's a perfect way to introduce me right now. I work at a school, so I work at a K-8 school right now as a school psychologist. I also have a private practice. And as you said, I have 2 fantastic teenagers myself. I have a almost 13-year-old and a 14, almost 15, which is a huge endeavor for anyone out there who has teens.
Awesome. And it was so great to have you here today, Christy. We frequently talk with Christy here on the webinars, and it's always great to have her back. And in our past webinars at Digging Deep, we've also talked about building resilience and fostering a growth mindset in teens. It's a frequent discussion we have. But sometimes in our life, our resilience, no matter how resilient we might be, is dramatically tested, like during a pandemic, for instance. What we have gone through as a society is not something the average person is prepared to deal with. No one was ready for this, and it's definitely something that in the past 100 years no one's dealt with. So my first question for you, Christy, is this: when we are facing or have recently faced a challenge that is much more daunting than anything we have faced before, something that feels just way out of our control, how important is it to allow yourself to feel your feelings?
Oh, good question. So as we know, 2 people can experience the same life event and walk away with it with very different long-term impact. So one person might experience a big event and walk away from it with nightmares or regressing or really having some symptoms or red flags pop up in their lives, versus another person will see the same impact, say the same event, and not have lasting impact in their life. And it all has to do with how trauma is stored in our brain, which is actually evolutionary. So long time ago, if we saw a saber-toothed tiger, our brain would want to remember every single thing in the environment so that next time, if we were in a similar situation, we would know to be on guard, or we would know to be able to keep our bodies safe. So trauma is stored in our brain as an isolated piece. It's not integrated with the rest of our sort of more functioning or higher brain. So for that reason, you'll see these small symptoms. You'll see these red flags pop up in your everyday life. The other option, instead of storing it in your brain as a trauma, what the other person may have done is have a more integrated approach. So it's the same events, the chronological, the timeline, the factual events, and then they also have the emotions they were feeling during the time of the event. And if it's not stored isolated in your brain as a trauma, it's integrated. So how you were feeling during the time of the event are meshed together as one. And in your brain, it means all of these awesome neural pathways are connected. You feel empowered. You feel like you had some control of that situation, or at least control of your body and your reaction to it. So there's an example I like to give is one of my younger clients had a horrible death in his family. His mother passed away. And his last memory of her was being taken away in an ambulance. And he would come into my therapy office and immediately go to the trucks. And, he would set up this sort of like a little house thing. And then he would have something over here. And then eventually in the weeks that progressed, the house became more, more detailed, a little bit bigger. And then he'd have sort of trucks coming into the house and then not leaving or smashing into a wall. And then over here, he started to develop this, other building over off to the other side. Meanwhile, in his daily life, he was having nightmares, he was wetting the bed, some of these regressive tendencies. And as we progressed through the weeks, as he was able to show me through, crashing the truck or breaking apart the house, how he was feeling, he slowly progressed to the representation of the ambulance coming up to the house, and then eventually going off and going to the hospital. And that sounds like a small shift, but for him, that was big because by the end, he was peacefully making that transition from home to the hospital. There was no longer the smashing, the crashing, the big explosion in his life. And his symptoms outside of the office also started to resolve. So he was no longer wetting the bed. He was no longer throwing food, doing those pieces. And what he did through play therapy is integrate what he experienced, which was the ambulance coming to his home and going off to the hospital, with how he was feeling in that moment, which at first was a lot of anger. And then we saw tears and sadness. And eventually he came to an understanding. So that was the integration of this traumatic event. So sometimes you can do it during the event, which is, very advanced. And then other times you need time to process it. So you need time to work through all of those emotions to integrate the experience with the emotions that you're feeling during that moment.
And thank you for clarifying. And again, that's, it may look differently in children, but adults essentially do something similar when they're trying to understand how to feel their feelings, correct?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. So if we have a big life event, so, in the United States, last night is a perfect example, or, in a bigger, wider picture, obviously the COVID experience. And if we are flooded with emotions, as for me, I was last night in watching the news, sometimes at some point I became so overwhelmed that I actually had to disengage. I had to sort of watch reality TV, if I'm to be honest. I clicked over. I just needed an emotional break. So if you find yourself needing to take a break or wanting to numb your emotions, obviously as adults, we have things like alcohol or different things like that. If you find yourself going to those, it's probably a signal that there's some big emotion there that needs to be integrated with your life events, and that's okay. And maybe you can deal with it now. And then maybe sometimes you just need to take a minute and watch reality TV. You need to take an emotional break before you can re-engage. So trying not to be judging your defense mechanisms. Try just to say, okay, this is what I need right now, and I will re-engage because I know what's happening right now in the world is important.
And that kind of perfectly leads into another question I had for you. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Thema Bryant Davis's podcast. It's called the Homecoming Podcast. She basically every episode talks about different kinds of emotional healing, feelings, dealing with trauma, things like that. And she's mentioned several times on her show how stress and trauma can lead to something called dissociation. Can you help explain what that is for those who aren't familiar with it? And how do we recognize it not only in ourselves, but another person, like a teen? And I know you covered that a little, but now we can bring dissociation kind of toward the forefront of this conversation.
Absolutely. So dissociation is a defense mechanism. So, and there's a huge spectrum. So you can have mild dissociation, and we've probably all done this, like when we're driving down the highway, and it may even be a drive we've done a lot of times. And for some reason, we were zoning out and we missed the exit. That's mild dissociation. You're kind of out of your body, or you're numbed, or you're zoned out. You can also go all the way through to where it has a major impact in your life. So something like multiple personality disorder, where you actually have created different personalities, dissociative personalities, to handle different life events or traumas. So dissociation as a defense mechanism is just like if you hurt your ankle and you protect it, so you limp a little. It's your mind's way of protecting yourself from emotions that your mind feels would overwhelm you. So it's sort of blocking those out or pushing those to side. It's important not to judge it so much as just recognize when you're doing it. And then when you have the time and space to sort of get curious about it, because the more you understand why you're doing it, the more you're consciously aware of your dissociation, the less you will unconsciously dissociate. So I have a perfect example in my own life. I moved from sunny Southern California to, I'm smiling and laughing because it's sort of funny, to Bellingham Washington during an El Nino year. So it rained forever. It rains like 3.9, I don't know, like crazy amounts of rain every day. It was gray and raining. And what's so interesting is every day I would have to hop on the highway, for 2 exits to get to work, go south on the highway. And every single day I would find myself missing my exit and continuing to drive south. And I would always sort of like wake up 2 exits later and be like, what am I doing? And I would obviously turn around and go back. And finally, one day when I got home, I really just sort of got curious with that within myself. Like, why am I doing that every morning, zoning out and driving south on the 5? Like, what is going on? And then I started to think about and be like, I think I miss the sunshine. I think I miss my friends and my family and the people in Southern California. And when I actually confronted that, and it was a really simple realization, obviously in reflection, but at that time, the very next day I stopped doing it. So once you make that conscious in yourself, why you're doing it or what might be happening for you when you're doing it, you dissociate a lot less, because dissociation is an unconscious defense mechanism.
And so there are levels of where it's okay and then where it can be dangerous. And so how do you recognize it in, let's say, your patient or child or younger sibling? Like, how do you recognize it in someone else? And how do you help someone else try to work through dissociation? Because when it's a parent talking to a teen, there's a little bit more need to lead them through this problem when it becomes a problem.
Absolutely. So, and I think myself included are noticing a lot of our teens are dissociating by doing things like getting lost in YouTube videos on their phone, or online games, or all kinds of different things where they don't have to actively participate. They're just sort of zoning out. First of all, it's completely okay. Again, just like not walking on a hurt ankle, your brain is trying to tell you, there's big emotion here. And right now, I don't know if you're in a place where you can process it, where you can handle it. Absolutely, that is completely okay. So when you see it in someone else, when you see someone trying to zone out or numb things, or spending a lot of time in front of the TV, and you're worried about that person, leaning in if you can, and allowing yourself to share your concerns, allowing yourself to share with them your observations in a non-judgmental, non-threatening way, is sometimes a great way to open that door where then they might get curious about when they are going for the phone to, check Facebook, or when do I most want to sit down and just numb out in front of the TV? Or like I said last night, watch, reality TV. And if you're curious about it, you can, instead of having it be unconscious and jumping over to The Bachelor, you can consciously say, oh, I'm noticing that I'm getting overwhelmed. I want to watch reality TV, which is completely okay. Or I could go for a walk. And if I go for a walk, I might actually feel a lot better instead of just shifting from one thing to another, like reality TV. I don't know that that will help me as much. So I'm going to consciously decide to actually close my computer and go for a walk. So what you're trying to do with yourself and with other people is just gently make yourself more aware. When are you going for those dissociative activities or behaviors? Why are you doing it? And then should they be replaced with something more healthy or more adaptive, like going for a walk, like connecting with your family, like writing in your journal, all of those things that can be a lot more sort of bucket filling or healthy for you compared to The Bachelor, which actually was quite a good season, the one I was watching yesterday. Just
We'll have to all check it out then.
There we go.
This is the perfect time to lead up to my next question I had. So I had a question for you about loss, because a lot of people have experienced loss in 2020, whether it be their job, a home, or a loved one. And the sense of loss many of us feel isn't just for what I mentioned. It could be, you know, what could be, you know, considered smaller, such as a loss of a social life, a sense of safety for young people missing out on major life events like graduation or prom or weddings. A lot of people have had to cancel or postpone their weddings. Because of the various reasons people are grieving, it's easy to tell ourselves something along the lines of, I shouldn't be feeling this way when someone is experiencing something so much worse. But we still need to deal with these feelings and grieve those losses, no matter how big or small they could be considered to be. Not to minimize certain losses, but you know, some degrees of loss are considered more to grieve and more painful. So I would love to hear your input on the importance of grieving, if you have anything about that particular topic for us.
Right. I sort of have two thoughts in what you were saying. The first one is I wanted to just respect what you were mentioning in terms of it's about the person's developmental level, their perceived feelings and loss, and that is valid, however they feel it. So when we have a teenager who developmentally is very much about their peer group, is very much about life transitions and accomplishments, you know, is very much in the here and now, because again, their prefrontal cortex, their ability to think of themselves, you know, into the future isn't developed at that age. The loss of something like prom is not something to be belittled. You know, in the teenage mind who lives very much in their body, in their here and now, that is absolutely something that needs to be processed and grieved. And all of the emotions around grieving, whether it be anger, sadness, or frustration, or denial, everything is completely valid for that person. So when we experience something significant for you, whatever that is, no judgment, the first step is exactly what you were talking about before, is just to experience or become aware of your feelings. So taking the time, allowing the space, how are you doing? And then the second step is very small, but it's also very important, is how big are you feeling those emotions? So when you're in the 0 to 5 range, you can still learn, you can still work, you can still connect with your friends, with your family. So you're feeling sadness, but it's manageable. When it's in that, you know, for little kids, I have them show me with their hands in that 5 to 10 range, the big range, I feel big. You know, for some kids, they see things in color. I feel red. I feel like a dragon. I feel roar, you know. That is when you can't learn, you can't connect, you can't be a good friend. Your body just, it feels like you just want to like scratch your face off sometimes, depending on the emotion. That's when you really need to go to step 3, which is your toolbox. So what do you need to do in that moment to help yourself get back into that 0 to 5 range? So please notice I'm not at all saying change your emotion. So if you're angry, I love anger, be angry. But if you're in the 5 to 10 angry, you're talking so fast, your finger, like I'm feeling afraid being with you that I can't help. So can we please go for a walk first? Can we please take a minute and pet our dog? Let's read this book for a second. and then let's figure this out. So all of those things I suggested are things that you can remind both adults and your teens, your children, that your loved ones in your life. These are all tools that they have in their toolbox to help them get into that 0 to 5 range. Now, sometimes as someone who is a caregiver, you might find that you're spending so much time in that 5 to 10 range and you just can't get out of it. And you can't seem to, like, all the tools that usually worked for you aren't working anymore. That's okay. That means that you are experiencing a pretty big major life event, like we all are with COVID. Maybe you do need some outside resources or support. And that's when something like, for a teenager, Shadow's Edge can be a very nice first intervention. It's an invitation. The journal pages are a gentle invitation to start to reflect on how you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Start to reflect on what are your triggers, what makes you angry, what makes you happy. And then if you are finding, again, that's not enough of an intervention, going and seeing a therapist, reaching out to someone on a consistent basis can be incredibly helpful. And it's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. It's recognizing within yourself, my typical tools, my typical tips and tricks aren't working. And I want to connect with my family. I want to connect with my friends. I want to work. I need some more support.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for touching on that. And would you say, so you mentioned how the 5 to 10 range of emotions is where it's harder to absorb any input or to learn things. Would you say that's kind of where, like, the harmful amount of dissociation happens? Like what we talked about earlier, is that kind of where it happens and where we need to try to take a step back and get to that 1 to 5 range?
Absolutely. And that's when you find yourself saying things that you don't really mean. That could potentially be dissociating. You do have people who have experienced major traumas, and they might say, it's like I was watching the car accident from above. That's dissociation. That's a classic definition of dissociation. And again, it's not a bad thing. Your brain is trying to protect itself, just like a cast protects your ankle. It's okay. It's just sort of a little flag that says, that was a big event. You experienced that as a big event. When we have time and space, let's go back and reflect on that. And let's make sure that we integrate what happened with how you were feeling when that happened. It doesn't have to be today. It doesn't have to be tomorrow. For some people, they just need to get up out of bed and get breakfast cooked for their family. And, you have to be doing these things. So it's not the time or place, but eventually you'll want to get to that so that you don't have these other symptoms like insomnia, like eating to self-soothe or not eating, or over-exercising or not exercising, like all of those pieces that aren't a healthy lifestyle.
Thank you so much for touching on that. So I have another question for you. So when you are at the point of where you're starting to become aware of the feelings, once you've kind of had that chance to come back to what you were feeling and to analyze it, what steps do you suggest, kind of more of a broken down amount of steps, do you suggest taking to begin using those emotions for our own personal growth? I mean, I know you mentioned it a little on how earlier with your analogy about how when you were driving down the road and you kind of started thinking about how you dissociate when you are driving in the rain, and that's where you made that connection about missing the sunshine. But what about for others who have not really quite done that before? How do we start to listen in and understand those feelings? And how do we help a teen or a young person do that?
Absolutely. I feel like it's incredibly important to recognize your triggers, to recognize change. So whenever someone comes to me as a family member and says, XYZ is happening for my teenager, usually my next question is always, is that a change in behavior? So if they've always gently been anxious, my daughter of the wind, she has asthma. It's always been a little bit of a sensory overstimulation, and it gets really windy here in Colorado. And now as a preteen, when her pituitary gland really ignited her amygdala, so her brain is getting tons of change, tons of blood, tons of stuff happening. Something like the wind is even more causing this anxious response. So if I were to go to a therapist and say, we would really love some help because on windy days, my daughter doesn't even want to go outside. So that particular barrier isn't really working for us anymore. His or her first question might be, is that a change? And we would say, no, like wind has always been hard for her to breathe, a little bit overstimulating. And right now it's especially acute. So the psychologist would then, again, it's all about getting curious. So, tell me more. Tell me, if this change was sudden. Tell me more about why you don't like the wind. Like, what is the sensation? And all of those things are just the therapist's way of helping you become more conscious of your unconscious behaviors, like avoiding going outside when it's windy. So we sometimes need help. We need someone, whether it's something like Shadow's Edge to prompt us with those journal pages, or you have your own journal, or you go to a therapist. Sometimes you need those supports. Other times you just simply need a quiet moment of mindfulness to reflect on your day, to reflect on, what would you say was a good part of your day? Some of these rituals around mindfulness, what were difficult parts of your day? And then just get curious about why. So oftentimes we try to judge emotion and say, this is good and this is bad. Instead, I would just try to say, okay, like, so you dropped the ball. Like my daughter was crying this morning because she couldn't find a math workbook. And I was on a Zoom call trying to teach, and I let her get frustrated. Maybe that's not what I should have done. And that's okay. So tonight, when I have a minute to myself, I might just wonder, like, well, what could I have done? Like, what would I have wanted to do? So you just sort of get curious without a whole lot of baggage around guilt and judgment. I hope that answered your question. I feel like I rambled. Sorry.
Sometimes with rambling, you answer more questions that we didn't know we had. So that's perfect.
Okay.
And so I want to touch base on something that probably happens a lot. I've seen it a lot personally on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter during the pandemic of this past year. So let's say there's a scenario where we've opened up about our feelings to someone, or alternatively, they've opened up to us. I wanted to ask you about something called toxic positivity. In case our audience doesn't know what it is, can you explain it? And are there instances where it can be more harmful than good during times of challenge?
Yes, so I'm sure other people, toxic positivity, my dad's Polish. It's not a problem I have. I'm kidding. So I'm not an expert. So if you're curious about this, I would suggest, talking or looking at people who've written about it more thoroughly. My understanding of it is simply the idea that if someone engages, it becomes sort of a disingenuous, you've got this kind of happy, kind of response to something where it doesn't fit with the storyline. So if someone shares with me a story that's really big or overwhelming, I might respond in a way that is kind of dismissive, but in that positive, slant, where it's like, I know you've handled hard things before, you've got this. And in the moment, that is very jarring because it's very different from the emotion that I'm sharing is very different from the life experience that has been shared, if that makes sense. The idea of is it good or is it bad is tricky, because what the person is saying is, I can't handle feeling the big emotion that you've just shared with me. So I actually need to defend myself a little bit. I need to say, I'm sorry, but you have to sort of keep that. I can't handle that right now. So I think the big piece is if you've shared something that's very personal, if you shared something that's a major life event, and the person gives it back to you gently, or even not so gently, with like very positive, like just very, disjointed from what you've shared, it's not about you. It's about what that person can handle in that moment. And that's okay. It's not what that person can handle forever. It's just right now in that moment. Maybe, their morning was really hard and they can't put another thing on their plate, or maybe they just don't have time to sit and really talk to you thoroughly about what that felt like for you, or what that feels like when they hear it from you. So it's really more about that person than it is a reflection of the story or the person who shared it. So the opposite side of the coin is also true, as you said. So if someone asks how I'm doing and I'm still processing, how I felt last night and all the images and videos that I saw, and my brain is just like going a million miles an hour, and we only have, a quick interaction, I might just say, oh, I'm fine. Good. How are you? I might just sort of, pass the ball back to you. And it's not a reflection of our relationship. It might just be simply, I need some more time to think about how I'm doing, or we don't have the time and the space to really sit down and talk about, honestly, how I feel about what happened and how I'm doing. Or even it's not socially acceptable. Like maybe you and I don't know each other very well, and I simply want to have, I just want to put on my manners and have a cordial exchange, and then I want to move on. So sometimes the toxic positivity is just simply a defense from really feeling the deep emotion that someone is sharing with you. Or if someone asks you how you are, really, it might not be the time or the place for you to share or really feel deeply. It is a little bit sad as a culture in the United States that we do have a tendency to keep the conversations pretty shallow, to keep that toxic positivity. I hope that we all try also to cultivate relationships where you do let some people in, where if you reach out to someone and say, how are you? And they say, fine. You say, really? Tell me more about that, because I saw you today really quickly and it looked like you were thinking about something. Like you have those friends in your life, those people in your family who do ask that follow-up question, who really honestly want to hear how you're doing. And they want to hear all the bits on your plate, the good bits, the yummy cheesecake, as well as the green beans. Like they want to hear about it all. So try to cultivate those relationships too.
Yes. And again, like you said, it's how in the US we tend to keep things shallow. Like I know, so with social media, you can look online and there are people who are kind of, it's good to also be positive, but there's a point where when you're so positive, someone can feel silenced and not feel like they can come out and say things and that others won't understand. And so, just like how you were mentioning, how when someone asks how you're feeling, you say, I'm fine. That's kind of like an internalized version of toxic positivity where you've taken it upon yourself and made it, even when it's not something that happened with you and that person, sometimes it's, and would you say it's like an emotional defense mechanism as well to internalize and to do it to yourself, essentially?
Absolutely. And it's not bad. It's just, all defenses are your brain's way of protecting itself. So when you try to turn off your emotions, just get curious about it. Like, why? Sometimes it's because I have to, if I really think about how I'm feeling, I'm not going to get out of this bed. And my kids need lunch. They need to get on their Zoom calls. Like, I've got to get the day started. In which case it's practical, like it's what you have to do in that moment, and that's not wrong. The tricky piece is at the end of the day, when you do have that moment to self-reflect, instead of taking a minute and doing a healthy thing, and I don't mean to judge, but doing something that would actually fill your bucket, whether that be spending time with your dog, going for a walk, writing in your journal, playing a video game, like filling whatever fills your bucket without judgment. Or do you try to not have the emotion perk back up by numbing it with alcohol or with other less adaptive ways to sort of suppress or deny or push down those emotions? Not that it's a bad thing. It's just noticing and then getting curious. Like, what would it be like if I chose to engage with the emotion? Like, would I be able to handle that, or do I need outside support? Because I feel like if I scratch off that, I hate to be gross, but that emotional scab, I might bleed out. Like it might feel overwhelming. So maybe I need a therapist in the room with me so that they can help me process those emotions. Because you don't want to have 5 glasses of wine every night, indefinitely. Eventually you want to break that numbing cycle. Eventually you do want to engage with the difficulty that you've gone through or are going through.
And eventually the season of The Bachelor is going to end, and we're going to need to.
I know, right? The worst thing is I watch old seasons. So the first thing I do is I figure out who they ended up with. And if I don't like that person, I don't watch that season. Like, I have a whole system of repressing my emotions. Like, I'm an expert.
That's so funny. And on that note, I just wanted to talk more about, so many of the people tuning in to the webinar and watching when the recording is online, people tuning into the recording are here to learn more about how to help the teens in their life begin to heal from 2020. Not that our problems ended with the new year, but this is kind of just like a phase of it, and we can heal from the previous phase and try to work through it as we start working through this next year. But I would love to acknowledge the adults that are taking time to listen today. One, it's amazing that you're tuning in and trying to learn more about how to help the young person in your life. But I also wanted to see if there's anything from you as a psychotherapist, as well as a mother, that you would like to tell these adults on, if there's any advice on how to help them themselves find ways to heal as they're helping their kids. Because, the kids are looking up to their parents or their therapist or their teacher, and that's a lot of pressure. So I would love to hear any advice you have for those adults in those positions.
Yes, I just, we met as a teaching team right before school started this morning to talk about how to help our middle school students specifically as they were watching the news and stuff last night, because our kids, our students in our school love to talk. They love to debate. They love to talk about current events. They're very passionate middle schoolers, which is amazing and something we cultivate. But it's also very triggering for teachers, especially if you haven't had the time to really integrate how you're feeling about what happened. And so much of both COVID and a whole bunch of our life experiences here in 2020 are pretty out of our control, which is scary. For both adults and for children. So the very first thing I said today to the teachers was check in with yourself, because from my frame of mind, this is called an object relations perspective. I believe when someone is feeling that 5 to 10 range or that big emotion, they sometimes, especially children or people who you're close to, you give that emotion to the other person. So that's the, someone, you say, hi, how are you? And the person just like throws up, like either anger, like, rah, 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 or like, a huge story of sadness or loss. And you're like, what? And what that person basically, or that child is basically doing is saying, this 5 to 10 emotion range, I can't handle it. I need help processing it. And they're giving it to you. It's like handing you a steak, like, here, help me. And what mothers do, or caregivers, what caregivers do to infants, when an infant gives this big emotion, is they pull them in, they snuggle them, they hold them tight. In grocery stores, when I hear crying, I still find myself like bobbing up and down. You do all of those soothings. And what you're doing basically is taking that infant's big emotion and you're giving it back to them as calm, or you're processing it for them. So when someone hands you this steak, this 5 to 10 range emotion, whether it's sadness, anger, frustration, whatever, they're asking you to please help me chew it, help me process this, just like an infant would. And that's when you would sit down with them and you would hand that big emotion back to them as calm, as grounded, as soothing. So in order for you to do that, you have to be in that calm place yourself. Because if you're also feeling in that big range, they're going to hand you a steak and you're going to hand it to them back, but like with more force. And then they're going to smack it back at you. Like, it's not going to be a productive exchange. So the very first thing all caregivers, all people who are trying to connect and trying to help other people process big emotions need to do is they absolutely have to be sure that you yourself are in a place where if someone hands you that metaphorical steak of emotions, that you can help them digest it. You can be calm, you can be present, you can be centered, so that they can then walk away feeling more in control of their body, more in control of their emotional life, more calm, more centered. And if you're not, that's okay. You have tools in your toolbox. You know how to self-soothe. Maybe today's the day that you get up a little early and hop on the Peloton, or you go for a run, or you just snuggle with your dog in the morning, or you read for a little bit, or you journal. Or sometimes there are days where caregivers, where people who are constantly, giving from their bucket, need to recognize this is a day where I need to be sure I start my day with my bucket full, because there's going to be a lot of dipping. I'm going to have to be there a lot for other people today, and that's okay. It's also okay to say, you know what, I care about you a lot. I'm just not in a place right now where I can have this conversation. Like, can we talk about this, later tonight, once I get all this other stuff? Once I do my work, I can then focus on you. And you can say that in a very respectful way.
And I mean, with things going on, whether, especially within family, where if it's the loss of a job or a home or a loved one, you're dealing with that loss at the same time as your child or your sibling or et cetera. Mm-hmm. And when you say it's okay to kind of say, hey, can I process this first? How would you approach that if you're the parent, but it's a teenager? I mean, I know you probably couldn't really say that to someone under the age of 7. It might be a little different because when they're younger, they need more immediate attention to those emotions. But with teenagers, they're getting closer to adulthood. And how would you phrase it with them, and also help them, because that would be a good teaching moment for them as they get older as well. How would you go about that with a teenager, like 14 to 18?
This is me. So this is like my perfectly messy and perfect answer to that. And I want to respect, and I would love to have a conversation with someone who disagrees, because I think that there's many answers that are incredibly correct to that question. In my opinion, so my mom is from Italy, my dad is from Poland. That has a huge impact on my emotional expression, as well as how I view difficulties, and how I view family, and how I view how you show yourself to your family. With that in mind, this is my imperfect answer. I'm an open book as much as I can be with my children. And I'm that way intentionally because I want them to see that someone who loves them is not perfect. I want them to see that I'm also internally struggling with understanding and dealing with big things. And here's how I'm doing it. And sometimes I mess up. And I'm all about that repair. So for example, this morning when my daughter was having trouble with math and I wasn't able to attend to it, as soon as I got off the Zoom call, I checked in with her and she pushed me back. And I said, I totally get that. I'm really sorry. You asked me one question and I ignored you. I get that. And I just sort of went through what it was like for me when she asked me that question and how I gave an imperfect response, and I was sorry. I was truly sorry. And then eventually when she felt ready to accept that apology, again, this all happened within like 45 minutes, you know, she came up to me and I'll show you what she handed me. She handed me my, I'm trying to learn how to knit. And she was like, oh, I saw this in the other room. I thought, and it was just like a gentle peace offering. It was like I get it. You made a mistake. I heard you, and here we go. Let's all sort of meet back together. So my gentle answer to your question is, even as a young child, I would show them all my messy bits, and I would ask them to love the messy bits as much as they love the perfect bits. And I'm not going to smooth over their life, and I'm not going to take every obstacle out of their way, because I think they can handle those obstacles. And I don't expect them to make me happy all the time, and I don't expect to be happy all the time. But I'll do everything I can to be present and to be focused and to love them unconditionally. And I hope and expect the same from them. So as an Italian Polish person who's all about those messy things, that's my answer. And I completely respect other people who do feel more protective of their children and trying to be sure that they don't, they have their children absolutely deserve to feel safe. I agree. But I also think that our children can accept and can feel big emotions, and they can accept and see big emotions from the adults in their life. But again, I recognize that that's not everyone's opinion, and that's okay, because sometimes that can feel pretty overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, again, it's like case by case basis. Every person's different. But I mean, in that way of doing it, you're building their resilience, and also kind of it's a little easier on yourself, because that way you don't have to be the perfect mom all the time.
Oh gosh, I could take you on a tour of my house and show you my imperfection. But if you wear it lovingly on your sleeve, and if you always come at it with like, I love you, I truly want to spend time with you and connect with you. I think it's going to work itself out, even through the mistakes. I want to believe that to be true, but my kids are still young. So call me again in 10 years. Let's see how it all works out. It's like an experiment being a parent. It's like we put all the ingredients in the soup and we're stirring it up, and we have no idea if it's going to turn out good or horrible, but we're crossing our fingers and hoping for the best.
That's amazing. I'm not a parent, but I am, I'm 25, so I'm not too far out of being out of the house. And as a young person who saw my mother did something similar, it was very honest about emotions, and it helped me as a person grow. So yes. Now as an adult, I can have these conversations with someone else and be like, hey, I benefited from that. So not everyone will, everyone's different, but it helps later down the road. But so just to kind of we have 10 minutes left. I'd love to kind of do some final thoughts, as well as open up for some questions. And then I would love to talk about how, so Shadow's Edge, again, is a product of the Digging Deep Project. It's a mental health mobile game to help teens and young adults with chronic illness, such as like cancer or chronic pain, things like that. But we've also kind of had a natural influx of people since the COVID crisis, kind of coming in to help deal with these big emotions they're having. And I would love to talk about like the different ways, just ideas, if you're getting your young person into the game, or if you yourself, because we've had plenty of people outside of our targeted age range benefit from it. But first, I want to summarize kind of what we talked about. So a big part of healing comes with us kind of delving into our emotions, and to kind of allowing ourselves to feel our feelings, and to, also being forgiving if we need to kind of shut down for a little bit, and then also remembering to come back and to have those emotions and to have time to grieve. Is that kind of a good way to summarize what we've talked about, Christy? I
think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And we've covered so many things, so it's a little hard to summarize it that quickly. I would love to see if anyone in our audience has questions. I'll check our Facebook Live, because we're also streaming there.
Before we tiptoe into that, I just wanted to specifically talk a little bit about Shadow's Edge and COVID, if that's okay, because I think the parallel is actually really beautiful. So first of all, with COVID, I am actually a huge fan of Joseph Campbell's work with the hero's journey. So Joseph Campbell would say that, throughout many cultures, there's this constant storyline in books and films, as well as our own lives, where we get an invitation. So for example, with Harry Potter, like he gets an invitation to go to Hogwarts, and he leaves Privet Drive, he goes to Hogwarts. He has all of these battles, all of these experiences, whether it be with Draco or with Voldemort or whatnot. And then at the end of the school year, he goes back to Privet Drive, but he goes back to Privet Drive changed. So the experiences that he had at Hogwarts made him a different person. And to me, that's such a beautiful metaphor for COVID, because we all had this invitation like thrust upon us with COVID. Our lives changed dramatically. We had many battles. How do we teach on Zoom? How do we do this? How do we have our family, my child working at school next to me while I'm trying to work here? Like all of these things, like how do I go to the grocery store? Completely changed. And now as the vaccine is coming out, as we are, obviously yesterday the numbers were horrible, but hopefully as things with the vaccine and such get more under control, we go essentially back to Privet Drive, but we go back to Privet Drive changed. Our world, like we're walking out and it's different. And to me, that's why I love the storyline of Shadow's Edge, because the very beginning of Shadow's Edge, there's a huge disturbance in the person's life. And then they go through the elevator and they walk out, and their world, which was once live and beautiful and full of promise and joy and not a scary place, is now gray. And they have to go in and re-engage with their world. And to me, that's exactly what so many teenagers and people are going to feel as we step out into the world, as we go to King Supers without a face mask, you know, and we get triggered, like, oh my gosh, there's someone without a face mask. Like, is that a threat? Is that scary? Am I going to get sick? And you're like, whew, okay, hold on. That's old, you know, that's old baggage kind of thing. So I really love Shadow's Edge because it gives that idea, it plants that seed, the storyline does, in brains that says, even if it's a different world, even if you go back to Privet Drive and it's not what you left behind, you can choose to engage in it as a changed person. It can be different, but it's also can be beautiful. Like, it can be better. So maybe as you emerge into your world, you used to love track and field, and now that shoe doesn't seem to fit anymore because it doesn't seem like that's important. And as a teenager, they change their focus to be more into activism, because now after they experience COVID, they realize that's where they want to spend their time, love, energy, and passion. That's the exact idea of growth. Like, that's post-traumatic growth. I took all these life experiences that happened when I was kind of in that underworld or during COVID, and I came into my new world changed hopefully for the better. And again, that's why Shadow's Edge is beautiful, because it's not just the storyline and the metaphor, but it also helps teenagers with those journal pages. It helps you get to that post-traumatic growth place, which I think is amazing. And it's free.
It's free. And something I have been mentioning to anybody I'm introducing the game to is it's free, but you don't get like swarmed with ads. So it's a little, you can sit and actually work on yourself without a pop-up of like, play this other game. So totally. Which can be kind of jarring. And it's like, oh, I was here to work on myself. No thanks. Yes. But our game doesn't have ads. And so I had a question for you, and I'm trying to remember what it was, but we have about 5 minutes left. Again, I wanted to double check and see if there are any questions from the audience at all. If anybody has a question, we'd love to answer it. While we wait to see if a question comes in, back to what you were saying, Christy, is it's also great about, Shadow's Edge is that the characters that you meet, the guardians, kind of are like, it's like when you're coming out of a challenge, whatever phase you're in, because the game goes through phases of emotional development after an event in your life. There's disruption, disillusionment, and the discovery phase. And it's kind of nice to have a character that is kind of, could be where you're at or where you were at or where you want to be at. And it's kind of nice because when they talk to you, that you're like, I feel like I've said something like this before, right after this happened. And the world and the characters are both kind of reflecting that. And I think that also kind of helps with, a little bit of the therapy side of it, where you can literally like talk to yourself. Like, yes. What are you going through? But I'm separated from it, and that's where I can work on it.
Right. So that's sort of the idea of a potentially more healthier, adaptive alternative to, at the end of the day, when you do have that minute to yourself, you absolutely could grab a glass of wine. And I think that's great. But maybe you grab a glass of wine and also do something like journaling, or do something like Shadow's Edge, or maybe you go for a walk and then you come back home and give yourself a minute to reflect. The idea is that you are constantly trying to integrate what's happening in your world factually with how you're feeling, and you're not just having these two be vastly out of sync, because that's when it doesn't feel like you're in your body. So for some people, it feels like dissociated from yourself, who you want to be, who you are. But all of these tools can be really helpful to get you into that reflective space. I also wanted to mention in Shadow's Edge, there's a really great little character. It's this pigeon, and the pigeon has tons of tips that are those tools in your toolbox. So it teaches you things like not just how to, like, don't just breathe, but like how to breathe, that actually gets you the maximum benefit of that self-regulation. So it has those reflective pieces, it has the storyline, but it also has, it constantly is putting in the teenager's toolbox lots of ways for them to be able to hopefully self-regulate later on when they need those tools.
And that's amazing that Christy and I are super proud to talk about Shadow's Edge, because it's all about what we're passionate about here at Digging Deep and Shadow's Edge. So if anybody, it looks like we don't have any questions, but if anybody would like to, if anyone has questions or comments, they are free to email us at feedback@Shadow's Edge. And we would love to hear if this is a kind of webinar you'd like to hear more of, or if you have a topic you would like to suggest for next month, anything like that. And we really appreciate all of you that joined us, whether you are a parent or a teacher, another therapist, or if you are the teen or someone else who is just looking to work on getting past what's happened in the past few months. And it looks like I have one question here. I do have one question, and the question is, how do you handle a dear friend who is increasingly confrontational and controlling as the pandemic has progressed and says hurtful things that trigger your own stress overload, and you have asked to give you a few days before response and refuses, saying you're stonewalling?
Wow, that sounds really, really hard.
And how do you counsel your teen on how to do that? So it sounds like this person is kind of stepping over your boundaries when you're already kind of stressed over what's going on. Is that that's kind of what I'm getting from the question.
Yeah, it sounds like the person is for very good reason. So people are now talking a lot about situational anxiety, situational depression, for very good reason, is either anxious or feeling big emotion in that 5 to 10 range on a regular basis. And what happens to your body if you are that elevated over a long period of time is you're not getting good sleep, you're not eating well. Your brain is actually filled with toxic chemicals, with cortisol, with lots of things that actually break down your ability to process, your ability to refresh. So knowing that your friend is in that 5 to 10 range, the first and most important thing to do is to recognize when you engage with them. Again, you have to be in a place where you can accept that emotional state, where you can accept where they are at right now. And if you're not in that place, that's okay. You can absolutely, as you were saying, Lacey, put up those boundaries and say, like, I'm sorry, I can't meet with you. Obviously, you can use manners. My close friend is from France, and she said that manners are her way of just engaging in these types of situations, is being overly polite, but also very firm. She has a beautiful way of doing it. But I think that is what is appropriate. Now, there might be times where you could go for a walk with this friend, where you could, take on that emotional stake and be ready and be there and be present for them and help them sort of self-soothe. But if you're not in that place, I'd say for your own mental health, respectfully put up boundaries and offer them some suggestions where they might have someone in a more professional capacity support them, because maybe you can't be what they need in their life right now. And it's okay to say that. And it's not about your relationship. It's not about what it's going to always be like. It's not about who you are as a person. It's not about who they are. It's just the current situation. You can't handle that 5 to 10 range. You can't make the time and space on your plate to do that. And that's okay.
I thank you for answering that. I hope we answered your question. Yeah, did we answer your question? I hope we did.
But what a great, I heard the person say, how do you tell your teen? Oh my gosh, I'd love the opportunity to help a teenager set boundaries when they're still in your house, so that when they go away to college or to their next phase in their life and they're not as close to you, that they can, if someone comes to them and they need to gently say, I'm sorry, but I can't be that person for you, whether it's at a job or emotionally. You're giving them the tools.
The college age.
Yeah, you're giving them the script that they can do that in a very polite and respectful way, but also very firmly. And also know that it's not about you, because that person might experience that as a rejection. So they might say something to that person, and for your teenager to feel confident enough to be like, you know, I hear you. And then in their mind, in their world, they're saying, that's your stuff. That's your steak. I just don't want to chew it right now. Thank you. Like, you have to eat it yourself to nourish yourself. I can't do that for you today, right now.
And I know we've mentioned steak several times. A lot of our listeners are probably going, ooh, that sounds good, actually.
I know. Or they're like, I'm a vegetarian. That's disgusting.
And it's also,
everybody.
It's also good to remember that it's not always going to go perfectly, even if you're super respectful. And I mean, it's always good to reflect, could I have said this a little differently? But sometimes it may not still be received well. So,
especially if someone hasn't heard no very much in their life, which is the case, you know,
or if they're kind of in that dissociated phase where they're just kind of having a hard time. They're just they're in that 5 to 10. They just are that connecting. It's like, they're like, I really need to get this out. And I'm really hurt that you aren't listening. And it's like, well, I am listening. I'm just also in that 5 to 10. It's good to remember it may not always go perfectly, and there still may be some hurt, but it can, you know, be repaired when later you're both in a place where you can talk about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who came, and to when this is a recording, thank you for watching. Again, feel free to email us at feedback@shadowsedge.com. And again, in case anybody missed it, that podcast, because I know I had someone ask earlier, that podcast I mentioned earlier, that's really great to listen to, especially about the toxic positivity. I know we talked about that a little bit. It's always good to listen to more outside. Like, it's always good to have multiple sources of information on this kind of stuff. It's Dr. Thema Bryant Davis and the Homecoming podcast. So, perfect. And thank you so much, Christy, for joining us. It was so great to have you. And I hope you do something like this again in the near future. And have a wonderful rest of your January, everyone.
Thank you.